They sent the message and waited for your reply. At first, it felt completely normal, almost automatic. That familiar rhythm of conversation continued, back and forth, predictable and easy. Nothing about it suggested that anything was about to change. You saw the message the moment it arrived. You understood exactly what it meant and what kind of response it expected. But instead of replying immediately, you paused. Not to calculate, not to manipulate, but because something felt different. For once, you didn't feel the need to respond right away. That small shift, almost invisible, created something most people never allow to exist. It created a gap where there is usually none. At first, the gap meant nothing at all. There was no signal, no tension, just a few seconds of silence that blended into the background of normal interaction. People are used to small delays. They expect distractions, interruptions, and busy moments. So, nothing about your silence stood out yet. It passed unnoticed, like a brief pause. But time has a way of changing things when nothing fills it. A few minutes pass, and still nothing comes from you. Now the silence becomes slightly noticeable. Not enough to cause concern, just enough to register. A small question forms quietly in the background. Did they see the message? That question lingers longer than expected. Another few minutes pass, and the silence remains. Now the question grows just a little stronger, because the expectation was simple and familiar. You reply, and the interaction continues. When that expectation is not met, something feels off. The mind tries to resolve the difference between what happened and what was expected. This is where most people react. They feel that gap and rush to close it. They send a quick reply, something small, just to restore the rhythm. But you didn't. You allowed the silence to stay, and as it stayed, it started to change. It was no longer neutral. It became noticeable in a quiet, persistent way. Not because you added anything, but because you didn't remove it. The other person begins to check. At first casually, without much thought, a quick glance, a brief moment of attention. But attention has now moved toward something unresolved. And once attention locks onto something unresolved, it lingers. Time continues to pass, and the silence grows heavier. Now it has lasted longer than what feels normal. This is where interpretation begins, because the mind does not tolerate uncertainty for long. It tries to create meaning where none was given. Without a response from you, the other person begins to fill the space. Maybe you are busy. Maybe you didn't see the message. Maybe it wasn't important to you. Each explanation attempts to settle the feeling, but none of them fully resolve it, because something does not match the established pattern, and humans rely on patterns more than they realize. When patterns break, attention sharpens instantly. Now, they begin to think back. They replay the last interaction in their mind, the tone, the wording, the timing, looking for something they may have missed, something that explains why this feels different. But there is no clear answer, because the silence was not created to send a message. It was created by the absence of reaction, and that is what makes it powerful. Not intention, not strategy, just a break in automatic behavior. At this point, something subtle begins to shift. The focus moves away from you reacting to them. Now they are reacting to the space you left behind. That space becomes active in a psychological sense. It holds attention without needing to do anything. It creates tension without visible effort. It invites interpretation without offering clarity. And most importantly, it removes certainty. Certainty is what keeps interactions stable and predictable. When people know what to expect, they relax. They stop analyzing, stop questioning, and simply continue. But when certainty disappears, everything changes. They start noticing things they previously ignored. Your timing, your patterns, your absence. Absence has a strange effect on perception. It amplifies value in a way that presence often cannot. Not because something becomes better, but because it becomes less accessible. Most people misunderstand where value comes from. They believe it is created by giving more. But often, it is created by withholding just enough, by not being immediately available at all times, by not following predictable patterns. Without realizing it, you have shifted your position. You are no longer part of a predictable exchange. You are now something that requires attention to understand, and that shift is where influence begins. Not loud, obvious influence, but quiet and subtle, because now they are investing mental energy. They are thinking, replaying, and trying to resolve something unfinished. The more they think, the more engaged they become. Not because you are doing more, but but because you are doing less. This is where most people make a mistake. They sense the shift and rush to respond. They close the gap and restore normal interaction. They explain, clarify, and remove the tension. And in doing so, they undo everything, because the power was never in silence alone. It was in what the silence created over time. Once you remove it too early, the effect disappears. So instead of reacting to the moment, you let it unfold. You allow time to do what it naturally does, because time, combined with uncertainty, creates depth. It turns simple interactions into something layered, something that stays in the mind longer than expected. At this stage, the other person is no longer just waiting. They are thinking in a more focused way, and thinking leads to interpretation. Interpretation leads to subtle emotional responses. Even if those emotions are not immediately visible, there is movement happening beneath the surface, quiet, gradual, and consistent. That is what changes everything, because the interaction is no longer external. It becomes internal. Internal experiences last longer and feel more significant. They are harder to ignore and easier to revisit. All of this started with something that looked insignificant. You simply did not reply, but in that absence, you created presence, not through words, but through space. And space, when left undisturbed, reshapes perception. It changes how people interpret behavior. It alters the weight of small actions. It creates meaning where none was explicitly given. That is why silence feels different when it is allowed to exist. It is not passive, and it is not empty. It is active in a way that most people do not understand. It creates pressure without movement. It creates attention without effort, and it builds tension without visible cause. Most people never experience this effect fully. They react too quickly and resolve everything too soon. They remove the very conditions that create depth. But when you step back, instead of stepping in, something shifts. You stop feeding the cycle of constant reaction. You stop maintaining predictable patterns. You allow space to form naturally, and that space changes how everything is perceived. You are no longer just part of the interaction, you are influencing it without direct action. Because absence, when it replaces constant availability, has weight. It carries meaning even when nothing is said. It forces attention to move inward instead of outward. And once attention moves inward, it stays there longer. That is where the real shift begins. The moment eventually arrives when you decide to respond, not because you feel pressure and not because the silence became uncomfortable. You respond because you choose to, and that distinction changes everything. Most people reply to relieve tension. You reply after the tension has already done its work. That difference is subtle, but it completely alters the dynamic. Before, your response maintained the interaction. Now, your response concludes a phase that already shifted perception. When the message appears, it is read differently than it would have been before. The same words carry more weight, more presence, more attention. Not because the message itself changed, but because the context around it did. Time reshaped how it would be received. Silence prepared the ground before anything was said. This is why timing matters more than wording in most interactions. People focus on what to say, but overlook when to say it. Yet timing controls interpretation more than language ever will. Your reply is no longer just information. It becomes resolution to something that was left open. And resolution always feels significant after uncertainty. The other person sees the message and immediately engages with it. Not casually, not automatically, but with focused attention. Because now there is something to resolve. They read it carefully, sometimes more than once, looking for tone, meaning, intention behind the words, trying to understand what your silence meant in relation to this response. This is where your restraint continues to matter, because what you say next can either maintain the shift or erase it completely. Most people make the same mistake here. They overcorrect, they explain the delay, they justify their silence, they try to smooth things out and return everything to normal, and in doing that, they remove the entire effect, because explanation removes ambiguity. And ambiguity is what created the attention in the first place. When everything becomes clear again, the mind relaxes. It stops analyzing, stops questioning, and stops investing energy. So, instead of explaining, you stay consistent. Your response is simple, direct, and unaffected. No extra details, no unnecessary emotion, no attempt to compensate. This is where your behavior reinforces the shift. because now your silence and your response align. There is no contradiction between them. You didn't disappear and come back with urgency. You remain steady the entire time. That consistency builds a different kind of perception. It signals that your behavior is not reactive. It is controlled, deliberate, and independent of external pressure. People notice this even if they cannot explain it. They feel the difference without fully understanding why. And that feeling is what changes how they respond to you. Now something else begins to happen. The interaction starts to rebalance. Before, there may have been an uneven dynamic. One person giving more, responding faster, maintaining the flow. Now that pattern has been interrupted. And once a pattern breaks, it rarely returns to exactly what it was. The other person adjusts, often without realizing it. They become slightly more aware of their own behavior. They think a little more before sending messages. They notice timing in a way they didn't before, because now there is uncertainty in how the interaction will unfold. And uncertainty creates a tension on both sides. This is where influence becomes sustainable, not through one moment, but through a change in pattern. You are no longer reinforcing predictable exchanges. You are introducing variability without chaos. That balance is what makes the shift stable. Too much unpredictability creates confusion. Too much predictability creates indifference. But a controlled mix of both creates engagement. And engagement is what most people are trying to achieve without realizing it. Now, as the conversation continues, you maintain the same approach. You do not rush to fill every gap. You do not react instantly to every message. You allow space to exist naturally between interactions, not as a tactic, but as a new baseline. This is where the real transformation happens, because it is no longer a single moment of silence. It becomes part of how you interact consistently. And consistency is what turns a moment into identity. People begin to associate you with a certain presence. Calm, measured, not easily pulled into immediate reactions. That perception builds over time through repeated behavior, and once it forms, it becomes difficult to change. Not because you are forcing anything, but because you are no longer overgiving. You are no longer filling every silence or explaining every detail. You are allowing interactions to breathe. And when interactions have space, they gain depth. Depth creates memory. People remember interactions that feel different, not louder, not more intense, just different from what they expect. Most conversations are forgettable because they follow the same pattern. But when you introduce space, you introduce contrast, and contrast is what makes experiences noticeable. Now the other person begins to anticipate differently. They are no longer certain when you will respond, or how quickly. That uncertainty keeps attention active. It prevents the interaction from becoming automatic again, and automatic interactions are where interest fades. At this point, something deeper is happening beneath the surface. The interaction is no longer driven by habit, it is driven by awareness. Both sides are paying more attention, even if only slightly. And that slight increase in attention compounds over time. It builds a different kind of connection, one that is not based on constant communication, but on meaningful, spaced interaction. This is where most people misunderstand the concept completely. They think silence is about ignoring or withdrawing, but that is not what creates the effect. What creates the effect is controlled presence, knowing when to step back and when to step in, without overcompensating in either direction, because disappearing completely breaks the connection, but constant presence weakens it. The balance between those two extremes is where influence exists, and that balance requires awareness, not effort. It is not something you force or calculate constantly. It is something you allow once you stop reacting automatically. At this stage, your behavior feels natural rather than strategic, and that is important. Because anything that feels forced becomes unstable over time. Natural behavior sustains itself without pressure. That is what makes this shift long-lasting. You are not trying to control the interaction. You are simply not giving away control through constant reaction. And that difference is everything. Because control is not about dominating or directing others, it is about managing your own responses. When your responses are no longer automatic, everything changes. You create space before reacting. You choose timing instead of following it. You respond with intention instead of impulse. And those small changes reshape the entire dynamic. Now the interaction continues, but it feels different. Less rushed, less predictable, more intentional. there is a quiet tension that was not there before, not uncomfortable, but noticeable. That tension keeps both sides engaged without effort. And engagement is what sustains attention over time. Without it, everything fades into routine. With it, even simple interactions feel significant. That is the effect you created without saying anything at first. And that is the effect you maintain by not overcorrecting later. It is not about silence itself, it is about what silence allows to develop. Attention, interpretation, and emotional investment. Once those are in place, everything else becomes easier because you are no longer trying to create interest, you are maintaining it. And maintaining something is always easier than creating it from nothing. This is where the real advantage appears. Not in a single moment, but in a sustained shift. You move from reacting to being observed, from filling space to allowing it, from explaining to simply existing within the interaction, and that presence, quiet and controlled, carries more weight than constant communication ever could.